Emma's breath came in shallow gasps as she lay on the cold, damp ground. Her body, still battered from the escape, now ached with a new intensity from the fall. The taste of dirt clung to her mouth, but it was the silence, oppressive and unnatural, that sent shivers down her spine. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, like something was holding its breath, watching her. Slowly, painfully, she forced her limbs to move. Her hands, scraped and trembling, pressed against the cold earth, her muscles burning with each effort. Every inch of her wanted to stay down, to rest, but something in the weight of that silence urged her to stand. As she rose, unsteady, a terrible realization dawned on her. Everything felt wrong. The air around her pulsed, faint but unmistakable, like a distant heartbeat vibrating through the very ground. Emma's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. The maze wasn't just alive, it had drawn her deeper, to its very core. She was in the belly of the beast, where it was strongest. Her eyes darted around the chamber, where slick, moisture-coated walls reflected faint light. Thick, rope-like vines clung to the ceiling, undulating in slow, hypnotic waves. They seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the maze itself, like predators biding their time. Emma's pulse quickened, and the prickling sensation of being watched crept along her skin. She could feel it. The maze was aware of her. A shiver ran down her spine as she took a cautious step forward. Her boot brushed against something metallic. She froze, her heart racing. Crouching down, Emma's fingers hesitantly reached for the object half buried in the dirt, a broken lantern, its glass shattered. Nearby, tangled cables snaked across the ground, remnants of what once had been a lively celebration above. Torn banners still fluttered limply from the slick walls, a haunting reminder of the night that had gone horribly wrong. Her chest tightened at the sight of the wreckage, her thoughts flickering to the friends she'd lost. They had been here. This was their final resting place, claimed by the unforgiving maze. But, among the scattered debris, a small glimmer of hope sparked in her heart. The broken lantern? The cables, they were more than just memories of what had been. They could be her lifeline. Emma knelt, her hands shaking as she reached for the nearest cable, the cool metal bringing a fleeting sense of grounding. She was running out of time, out of options, but not out of fight. Not yet. She could still survive. The maze hadn't broken her yet. The faint slithering of vines echoed somewhere in the distance. Emma's grip tightened. The maze was patient, but so was she. She would find a way out of this, no matter how deep she had fallen. Emma crouched low, her muscles taut as her eyes flicked over the chamber. The vines were no longer just creeping in the distance. They were closer now, curling and twitching with a deadly intent under the dim light. The slithering sound of their movements echoed through the chamber, like a predator closing in on its prey. At first glance, the vines seemed erratic, chaotic, as if playing some twisted game of cat and mouse. But Emma had learned to look deeper, to feel the pulse of this living labyrinth. There was something more here, a pattern. Her heart pounded in her chest as she noticed it. The vines would strike forward, their thorny tendrils reaching out like serpents, only to recoil just before reaching her. Each attack followed by a brief pause, a moment of stillness before the next strike. It was almost imperceptible, but there, an underlying beat, a pulse, the same heartbeat she had felt thrumming through the earth beneath her feet in the belly of the maze. The maze was alive, but it wasn't just alive. It was predictable. Emma's mind raced as the realization took hold. If she could time her movements to the rhythm of the strikes, she could avoid them. She could survive this. Her hands tightened around the broken lantern beside her, its jagged edges cold against her palm. Her fear slowly transformed into something more, a fierce determination that burned through her exhaustion. She closed her eyes for a brief second, steadying her breath, focusing on the rhythm. 1, 2, 3. The vines recoiled, their slithering bodies pulling back ever so slightly. Now Emma darted forward, her body a blur of motion as she lunged toward the tangled mess of cables on the ground. Her hands, still trembling, worked frantically to free them from the thick roots that coiled around them like a snare. Her muscles screamed with the effort, but she couldn't stop. Not now. The cables were her only chance. The vines twitched, their thorny tips brushing the ground just inches from her. She froze, counting the beats again, her breath trapped in her chest. 1, 2, 3. Strike. Pause. Strike. The rhythm continued like the ticking of some ancient, malignant clock. Timing her next move, Emma jerked the cables free just as the vines lashed out once more, the air hissing as they missed her by a hair's breadth. Her hands moved with urgency now, stripping the cables with a shard of broken glass. The wires sparked faintly, a tiny flicker of light in the oppressive darkness that surrounded her. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope. The maze seemed to sense her defiance, the heartbeat of the chamber quickening. The vines hissed in the shadows, retreating only to prepare for another strike. But Emma was ready. She could feel the maze watching her, testing her resolve, but she wasn't the same terrified girl who had fallen into this nightmare. The cables in her hand sparked again, brighter this time, and Emma's lips curled into a tight smile. She wasn't just fighting to survive anymore, she was fighting to win. The air around Emma felt suffocating, thickening with each shallow breath she took. The steady rhythm of the vines she had once observed now fractured, replaced by a violent, erratic pulse. Their movements had grown faster, more aggressive, like predators closing in on wounded prey. The once predictable pauses vanished, leaving Emma no room for mistakes. The vines snapped through the air, each strike laced with lethal intent. The chamber itself seemed to pulse and contract, as though she were trapped inside a living, breathing creature. The walls, slick with moisture, quivered like flesh, and the sensation of being slowly suffocated crawled over Emma's skin. Every inch of the labyrinth vibrated with a malevolent energy, pressing down on her, driving fear deeper into her bones. Her hands trembled as she worked, stripping the wires with frantic urgency. She could feel her focus splintering, torn between the cables in her hands and the vines that crept closer with every heartbeat. The oppressive energy of the maze wasn't just around her, it was inside her, worming its way into her mind, choking her with doubt and dread. She knew the maze was watching, its dark intelligence coiling tighter, ready to strike when she faltered. The pulse quickened, turning the chamber into a nightmarish prison, the walls closing in. Emma's breath hitched as her grip on the cables began to falter, panic gnawing at the edges of her resolve. But then, something caught her eye, a small glint among the thorns. She squinted, her heart skipping a beat as she recognized it. Mia's bracelet. It was smeared with blood, tangled deep in the vines, a haunting reminder of her friend's fate. The sight hit her with the force of a gut punch, and for a moment, the weight of her friends' deaths crashed down on her like a tidal wave. Mia, Jake, Sophie, Mark, all gone, consumed by the maze's insatiable hunger. And now, it was coming for her too. But Emma wasn't done. She couldn't be. The raw pain of loss ignited something fierce within her. No, she refused to let the maze win. Not after everything she had lost. Fueled by a newfound desperation, Emma yanked at the cables, her hands moving faster now, even as the vines lashed out mere inches from her face. She ducked beneath a sweeping strike, her heart pounding in her chest, adrenaline flooding her veins. The maze wanted her to stop, to break, to fall into its clutches. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. The wires sparked again, brighter this time, more hopeful. A small flame flickered to life in her hand, fragile but real. Emma stared at the tiny flame for a brief second, her mind racing. It wasn't much, but it was something. The heat from the flame forced the vines to recoil, hissing as they withdrew, if only for a moment. Emma clutched the flickering light tightly, her last line of defense against the crushing grip of the maze. It wasn't a victory, but it was enough to survive a little longer. The vines, though momentarily pushed back, still writhed in the shadows, waiting for her to stumble, to falter. But Emma's resolve hardened. The flame in her hand might be fragile, but it was defiant. Just like her. The maze wasn't finished. But neither was she. The rhythmic pulsing beneath Emma's feet intensified as she moved deeper into the maze. Every beat seemed to shake the ground, her heart now pounding in sync with the sickening thud. Each step she took felt more deliberate, weighed down by the growing sense of dread. The narrow, twisting corridors opened suddenly, revealing a cavernous chamber, larger and more foreboding than anything she had encountered before. The stifling air was thick with the scent of rot and decay, and the walls around her pulsed subtly, as if alive, shifting like the skin of some grotesque creature. And at the chamber's center, it waited. The heart of the maze, a massive, pulsating plant, looming like a twisted, dark throne. Its central flower, monstrous and grotesque, oozed with a malevolent power, the slick dark petals curling outward to reveal thorned vines that slithered and writhed, stretching up the walls and ceiling like veins feeding the maze itself. Every inch of the plant radiated ancient evil, its presence so suffocating that Emma could feel it pressing into her very bones. She staggered forward, her legs trembling as the sight of the monstrous plant filled her with dread. This was the source, the root of the labyrinth's cruel sentience. The maze's power flowed from it, and if she could destroy it, she might have a chance. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the fragile flame she had ignited. It flickered weakly, but it was enough. It had to be enough. The vines around the plant twitched, reacting to her presence. The rhythm she had followed, the pulsing beat of the maze, now echoed in her ears, hammering into her mind. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't charge blindly. The plant's tendrils recoiled and struck with lethal precision, like the vines she had narrowly avoided earlier. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but she knew there was no other way out. She edged closer, her eyes locked on the pulsating flower at the core of it all. The vines slithered toward her, sensing her approach. The chamber itself felt alive, breathing in sync with the monstrous plant. Each pulse seemed to grow stronger, the weight of its power bearing down on her, suffocating her with every second. Emma crouched low, her muscles tense and ready, her mind racing for the perfect moment to strike. Then, the plant moved. Its grotesque head swiveled toward her, the dark petals peeling back like the jaws of a great beast. From the heart of the flower, a gaping maw opened, oozing thick black sap that hissed as it hit the ground. The air filled with a pungent, acrid smell. Thick vines shot out toward her, faster than any she had encountered before. Sharp, precise, and lethal. The plant wasn't just defending itself anymore, it was attacking. Emma barely had time to react. A vine lashed out, catching her by the leg, its thorny tendrils digging deep into her flesh. She cried out in pain, stumbling backward as it yanked her toward the maw, the venomous sap dripping dangerously close. She struggled, kicking at the vine with all her strength, but its grip was too tight, the thorns tearing through her skin as blood dripped to the ground. Emma slashed at the vine with the shard of broken lantern still clutched in her hand. The jagged glass cut deep, severing the vine with a shriek. It recoiled, writhing in pain, and Emma scrambled to her feet, her leg burning from the deep gashes. But there was no time to stop, no time to rest. The plant's rhythm faltered for just a moment, the vines pulling back. Emma saw her chance. The moment had come. The vines surged forward again, but this time, she was ready. She ducked low, narrowly dodging the first strike, the thorns grazing her face as they passed. Her heart raced, her breath quickening, but she didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, thrusting the small flame she had nurtured deep into the plant's core. The dry edges of the central flower caught fire instantly, the flame spreading with a hiss. Emma's hand trembled as the fire began to consume the plant, its flames licking up the dark petals and into the heart of the beast. For a brief, deafening moment, the chamber fell silent. Then the plant screamed. A high-pitched, unnatural wail erupted from the core, reverberating through the entire chamber, shaking the walls and floor beneath Emma's feet. The vines flailed wildly, lashing out in all directions. One of them caught Emma by the arm, yanking her toward the burning maw. She screamed as the thorns dug into her skin, but she didn't let go. The fire had taken hold and the plant was weakening. With one final surge of strength, Emma grabbed a handful of burning petals, pressing them deeper into the heart of the creature, ignoring the searing pain that shot through her fingers. The flames roared to life, consuming the core entirely. The plant let out one last ear-piercing wail as it writhed in its death throes, the vines flailing chaotically before going limp. The chamber trembled violently, the ground cracking beneath her feet as the maze itself began to collapse. Emma staggered back, her body screaming in pain, but her eyes remained locked on the burning core. The plant screeched again, its thrashing growing weaker and weaker. The pulse that had once driven the maze slowed, then stopped altogether. The heart of the maze was dying, and so was the maze. The chamber shook violently, as though the very foundation of the maze was tearing itself apart. The once steady pulse was now a frantic, chaotic rhythm, echoing the death throes of the labyrinth. Vines whipped through the air with wild abandon, their thorny coils lashing out in every direction. Emma cried out as one wrapped tightly around her arm, the thorns biting deep into her skin. Blood flowed freely down her arm, but she didn't stop. Gritting her teeth against the pain, she tore herself free, feeling the searing sting as the thorns ripped away from her flesh. The maze was dying, but its final moments were more dangerous than ever. The ground beneath her feet shifted and cracked, threatening to collapse at any moment. Emma stumbled, barely catching herself as a vine slashed past her face, missing by a breath. Time was running out. At the heart of the chamber, the massive plant writhed in agony, its blackened petals curling inward as flames consumed it. Yet it wasn't enough. The maze wasn't going down without a fight. The vines surrounding her flailed in a desperate attempt to protect the dying core, striking out with terrifying intensity. Emma's breath came in short, ragged gasps, her vision blurring as sweat and blood mingled, stinging her eyes. But even as her body screamed in protest, she refused to give up. Not when she was so close. The ground buckled, jagged cracks spreading like a spiderweb, threatening to swallow her whole. But she kept moving. The plant's screams began to weaken, the frantic rhythm of the maze slowing as its power waned. Breathless, watching as the once mighty flower shriveled before her eyes. Its blackened, twisted tendrils collapsed in on themselves, lifeless. The oppressive weight of the maze's malevolent presence lifted, and for the first time, she could feel the maze's grip loosening, its hold over her crumbling. She had won. But even as the central flower withered and the vines fell still, Emma could sense it. The maze wasn't finished with her yet. The ground beneath her feet trembled violently, and a deep, rumbling sound echoed from the depths of the chamber. The walls began to crack, splitting open as chunks of stone and vine fell around her. The entire labyrinth was collapsing, dragging itself into oblivion in its final act of destruction. Emma's heart raced as the realization hit her. She had defeated the maze, but now it was trying to take her down with it. With no time to waste, Emma scrambled to her feet, every muscle burning from exhaustion, and sprinted toward the nearest tunnel. The floor beneath her buckled and shook as the chamber caved in, massive chunks of debris falling from above, vines collapsing into lifeless piles. She dodged the falling debris, her breath coming in ragged bursts as she raced through the crumbling maze. The light at the end of the tunnel was faint, but it was there. Her way out, the walls around her cracked and groaned, vines shriveling as the power that once held them together dissolved. Emma's legs screamed in protest, but she pushed forward, leaping over fissures that threatened to swallow her whole. The sound of the maze collapsing behind her echoed like thunder, a reminder that if she slowed for even a second, it would bury her alive. With one final burst of strength, Emma lunged toward the light, throwing herself through the narrow opening just as the tunnel collapsed behind her. She hit the ground hard, rolling across the earth as the entrance caved in, sealing the maze forever behind a wall of debris and stone. She lay there, gasping for breath, the cool night air washing over her like a balm to her battered body. The oppressive weight of the maze was gone, its dark presence no longer pressing down on her chest. She had made it. She had survived. For a long moment, Emma simply lay there, staring up at the starry sky, her body trembling from exhaustion. The nightmare was over. The maze was dead. But as she closed her eyes trying to catch her breath, a single thought wormed its way into her mind. The maze wasn't just a place. It was alive. And something that was alive could never truly die. Emma staggered out of the collapsing ruins, every step a sharp reminder of the ordeal she had barely survived. Her legs threatened to buckle beneath her as she finally escaped the maze's suffocating grip. The cool night air washed over her, sharp and crisp, so unlike the stench of rot and decay that had filled the labyrinth. She stumbled, her legs giving way, and collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving as she gasped for breath. For a long moment, she stayed there, crouched on the ground, her hands digging into the dirt. The earth beneath her was solid and real, a stark contrast to the pulsating nightmare she had just escaped. Above her, the sky stretched wide and clear, a deep indigo speckled with stars that felt impossibly distant. The calm serenity of the night was jarring after the chaos and horror she had endured. She turned, her gaze sweeping over the remnants of the maze. What was once a deadly labyrinth, teeming with malevolence, was now a crumbled mass of debris and ash. The pulsating vines, the twisting corridors, the monstrous plant at the heart of it all, gone. The maze that had hunted her, tormented her, claimed the lives of her friends, was dead. But looking at the ruins didn't fill her with relief. There was no comfort in its destruction, no sense of triumph. Instead, a hollow ache settled in her chest as she stared at the wreckage. The maze had taken everything from her. Mia, Jake, Sophie, her friends, the people she had fought beside, were all gone. She had fought, she had survived, but she was alone. The weight of their absence pressed down on her like a physical burden, each name echoing in her mind with a painful finality. Mia's laugh, Jake's smile, Sophie's cautious nature, all memories now lost to the maze. Emma had escaped, but it felt like the maze had still won. Victory tasted bitter, laced with loss and grief. For a long time, Emma sat there, her knees sinking into the cool earth, her gaze locked on the remnants of the nightmare that had stolen everything. The reality of her survival weighed heavily against the cost. She had fought to stay alive, but what kind of life was left without the people who had meant everything to her? The hollow emptiness gnawed at her insides, a grief so deep it threatened to pull her under. But as she sat there, letting the cool air fill her lungs, she reminded herself of one simple truth. She was alive. The maze hadn't claimed her. Not entirely. She wasn't naive. She knew the trauma would follow her. The memories of the maze, the horrors she had faced, would scar her deeper than the cuts on her skin. The loss of her friends would haunt her. But she had survived, and that was something. The fire within her, though flickering and fragile, hadn't been extinguished. Emma slowly rose to her feet, her body battered, her spirit shaken, but her resolve intact. The ruins of the maze lay silent behind her, a graveyard of horrors, but she wouldn't look back again. Not now. The wind stirred gently, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and ash. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze brush against her skin, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the distance. She had survived the maze. Now she had to survive what came next. And that would be her next battle. Slowly, painfully, Emma pushed herself to her feet. Battered but unbroken, she turned her back on the ruins and began to walk away. Each step was heavy, her body aching from the ordeal, but she kept moving. The nightmare was over. Yet as she limped across the open ground, the memories weighed on her, an invisible burden she would carry with her.